Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will start now. Welcome to our discussion of the 9th Valdai Discussion Club meeting. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff speaking with me, as we did last year. He is an adjunct professor here at Georgetown, teaching in the Security Studies program and the CERES program, and he's the deputy director of the Russia-Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So as I said, this was the 9th Valdai. I have been to all 9 of them. And this time we didn't travel to far-flung places. We've been to Yakutsk before, and Khanty-Mansiysk, and Kizhi and Valam before, but this time we were in St. Petersburg and Moscow. The theme was economic scenarios for the future of Russia. So we had the discussion with our Russian colleagues. The way this works is the first 2 days we're with our Russian colleagues, and then we meet with top officials, including President Putin, and our Russian colleagues are not at those meetings, or some of them are at some of the meetings. And so what I thought I would do is I will talk about our meetings in St. Petersburg, the discussions about the Russian economy and the scenarios, and a little bit about some of the meetings in Moscow, and then Jeff will talk about our meeting with President Putin. And I should say, unlike all previous Valdais, and this particularly relates to the meeting with President Putin, there was very little official discussion of foreign policy. The focus was very much on the economy, on domestic politics to the extent that it obviously is part of the economy, but in a way it was unfortunate that we couldn't discuss foreign policy more, particularly with President Putin, because there's obviously a lot going on, and so there's some subjects about which there was less discussion. So I would just say that I came away with 2 primary impressions from this year's Valdai. And that is really, and it can be summed up, that domestically there was very much a feeling of kind of stasis. But when we did talk about foreign policy, there was of course much more a feeling of dynamism. And particularly when we talked about the economy, our Russian colleagues, we had some very distinguished economists and economic ministers, they understood what needs to be done to reform the economy, to move the country forward. But they felt that not very much had been done in the last few years, and they weren't sure that it would be done in the next 6 years. So one had this feeling again of stasis. There was very little discussion, by the way, of the opposition in Russia. And to the extent that there was, I think the impression that was conveyed was this was not something that was going to be particularly important in whether the economy moves forward or even in the political system itself. So really a kind of downplaying of all of that. But the second impression, in fact, was of a more dynamic view of the world, and certainly an assertion that Russia really does present a different model. This is not something new. It hasn't begun now, but I think, for me at least, it was crystallized in some of the discussions we had. First of all, and again, you'll hear this also in the discussion with President Putin, a discussion very much that Russia has its own value system, that the Russian Orthodox Church is a very important player in that domestic value system, that it is different from the value system of the West. It is equally legitimate and is not up to the West to tell Russia what its value system should be. So I think that was very much something that came through. And then the other side of this Russia as a different model had to do with foreign policy. And it had to do with a kind of basic Russian philosophical position or ideological position of absolute sovereignty, of the importance of absolute sovereignty for the different countries of the world, and for non-interference in other countries' domestic affairs, and a reiteration that the principles of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, which after all are now part of the United Nations principles too, that these were not things that the Russian government believed should be implemented, particularly vis-a-vis what's going on in the Arab world. And in fact, one of our interlocutors said, foreign countries don't have any right and should not interfere in the civil wars of other countries. So that was a very stark expression of, again, the idea that Russia does represent a different model domestically and in foreign policy, and it's an equally legitimate model. And by the way, on this point of kind of the stasis domestically, Sergei Karaganov, who it was really the, I guess he's the co-host of the Valdai Discussion Club, and certainly chaired all of our sessions in St. Petersburg, said that Russia has been in a frozen state for the past 2 years, and it needs to decide what kind of country it wants to be. And what he said was echoed by quite a few of the other interlocutors that we had. Now, let me say a little bit about the economic scenarios. So the person who wrote them was Leonid Grigoriev. He used to be at the World Bank here in DC. He's now a professor at the highest school in Moscow. And he had 4 scenarios for the development of the Russian economy. Just very briefly, the sanguine scenario, which was oil prices are high, reforms are successful. This is the good scenario. The second one was the phlegmatic scenario, which is there are economic reforms, but oil prices are lower. The third was the choleric, as you can see, this is all medical metaphors, with high oil prices and no economic reform. And the final one was the melancholy, which is low oil prices and no economic reform. Now, as you know, in scenarios, you're never supposed to give probabilities to them. But we did discuss that, and I would say most of the people there, including our Russian colleagues, tended to be towards the less sanguine, or not toward the sanguine scenario, but they all agreed that oil, the continuing high oil prices will play a very important role here. We also discussed some World Economic Forum scenarios. These have been requested by the Russian government. And it was interesting because they focused very much on whether the regions could be the motor of change and reform in Russia. And so we had discussions of different scenarios under which the regions might come in and say, no, things have to be done differently. I think maybe some of the outside, the foreign Valdai participants were a little bit more skeptical about that, but that raised some interesting questions too. We met with a number of, as I say, ministers. I think we had a very interesting presentation by Andrei Klepich, who is the Deputy Minister of Economic Development. He talked about, he said basically Russia is still in the same situation it was in the Soviet times, in as much as oil and gas contribute about 25% of Russia's GDP. That Russia is still then very dependent on oil and gas exports for its continuing economic functioning. He said the growth rates were too low, that they were now around 2.8%. Of course, that's better than some growth rates of some Western countries, but compared to what they'd been in Russia before, they were lower. And that Russia needed to outpace global economic growth if it wanted to move forward. And he talked about a crisis of governance, Minister Klepich did. So that was a very interesting discussion. The other interesting discussion from a Russian former official was from Sergei Alexashenko, who is, of course, a liberal critic of what's happening now in Russia, former deputy head of the central bank. And he said either we reform our institutions and the country gets a chance, or problems remain unresolved and we are stuck in a swamp. He also talked about, which was echoed by some of the other Russian participants, that you need to have a court system on which you can rely on, which is objective if you want to push forward, if you want to overcome the crisis of governance. And there he did mention Pussy Riot, but I won't say any more about that because I'm sure Jeff will say something about that too. And he said, there is no such thing as a Putin 2.0. President Putin has been in power for 12 years now, if you count the time when he was prime minister. And so what you see is what you're likely to get in the next 6 years. Boris Titov also participated. He's now the ombudsman. President Putin appointed him as ombudsman, business ombudsman. He talked about the business climate in Russia not being as good as it could be. It needs to be improved. That's his task. He has quite a lot of ideas about it. He said things are beginning to change. He said the Russian economy is more unprofitable for Russian investors than it is for foreign investors. So there was an agreement again among our Russian colleagues that institutions need to be reformed. reform, but that institutional innovative change cannot come from above, it needs to come from below, and you need to have the institutions in Russia that can promote growth from below and innovation from below. Then we went to Moscow, and we had an interesting and a much more upbeat meeting with Arkady Dvorkovich, who of course is a deputy prime minister. He was saying that the business climate is improving in Russia, that it's getting more comfortable. The World Bank has moved Russia up 8 spaces in its index of doing business, ease of doing business in Russia. He said FDI was going up in Russia, that the budget situation was better than in other countries, which of course is true, again, if you compare it to some European countries, and that the military reforms, he said, will be completed. It's interesting now with the change in defense ministers to see how that will work itself out. He spoke about Rosneft's acquisition of TNK-BP and said that BP's participation, which it still will have in this new Rosneft enterprise, will help improve the management of Rosneft. He said WTO is going to be a spur to Russian economic reform. He said Russia's next task is, of course, to join the OECD. Those discussions, of course, have already begun. And he said very much he hopes that Europe will move in the right direction, and said that Russia's future economic health will partly depend on what the Europeans decide and whether they can get out of their own crisis. And he also sounded an optimistic note on demography, which President Putin also did, that the birth rates are going up in Russia, and that more and more people are having 3 children, having a 3rd child. And this was a good sign. And when asked about the tandem, he said the tandem operates no differently than before. He said both members of the tandem are in constant dialogue, and they take decisions together. And he said then, it will be easier for Russia to deal with an Obama than a Romney administration, and I see that Mr. Dvorkovich was quoted today in the press as saying it's much better that Mr. Obama was re-elected. He's not the only one. Prime Minister McGhee said the same thing. We then were treated to a very interesting breakfast the next morning, or after this discussion with Mr. Dvorkovich, organized by Sberbank. And if you like, Herman Gref was the MC. He stood there with a microphone, and he had a panel of 2 ministers, Nabiullin and Silvanov, and then economic experts like Vladimir Mao. We had Igor Bunin, Alexander Aslon, these people obviously involved very much in polling data, Konstantin Rimchukov. And so this was a very interesting meeting where, in fact, Mr. Gref berated some of the ministers about the lack of economic reform in Russia. They debated amongst themselves. So that was a very lively discussion. And it was also interesting listening to the pollsters. So particularly Mr. Aslon, who said that there are 3 different Russias. And when they do polling, they look at these 3 different Russias. One is the non-working Russia. One is the contemporary working Russia, the younger people in the kind of modern economy. And then what he called the archaic working Russia, who are the older people or people involved in more traditional industries, and their different views. He talked about the brain drain, Mr. Aslon, and said it's a big problem. According to his data, 17% of the Russian population says they would like to leave for good, and that it is a challenge for Russia to keep the best and the brightest, the young people in Russia. And then our next meeting was with Alexei Pushkov. This was the only meeting we had where we talked about foreign policy. He is, of course, the chair of the Duma Foreign Relations Committee. And we certainly heard from him quite a lot of criticism of what the United States and the West have tried. They're trying to impose their agenda on Russia, particularly the United States. He said Russia isn't interested in joining NATO or the European Union. We are samostoятельный центр власти. We are an independent center of power, and that the outside world has to understand that. He talked quite a lot about the prospects for the Eurasian Union. This was something that some of our other Russian colleagues talked about too. Obviously one of the questions is how that will function and whether Ukraine will be a full member of that. He said the reset was over. It had worked, but now it couldn't work the same way anymore. I asked him a question about, if there were complaints about the U.S. having imposed its agenda on Russia. You know, we had a new administration coming in. I didn't know then who was going to be the president. But were the initiatives that Russia would like to take vis-a-vis the United States? And to that he replied just small steps. He talked about adoption, visas, but he said no big steps, no big initiatives. And then we also heard from him about the Arab Spring. Again, the idea that we shouldn't, you know, that one shouldn't be supporting opposition groups that were quite radical, but didn't know who they were, and that we shouldn't be interfering, the West, in civil wars. And then our, I guess, final meeting before the meeting with the president was with Sergei Ivanov, now the head of the presidential administration. He described himself as an economic liberal but a national security conservative. And we heard some of the same views about some of the foreign policy issues from him. He said that the Kremlin does not have a shadow government. Somebody asked him about, well, you have these parallel structures. You have Prime Minister Medvedev and you have a government, and then you have the people in the Kremlin who overlap with or have some of the same responsibilities as the people in the government. And he said the Kremlin, we adopt the strategy, but the strategic decisions, but they're carried out by the government, pragmatically, if you like. Certainly, I think one had the impression from Mr. Ivanov too that, you know, the economic problems that Russia has can be overcome, that there will be reforms, that the country would move forward. So as I say, I had at least a somewhat different impression of the way that domestic developments were portrayed, and then the way that foreign policy was portrayed, and where Russia was playing obviously a more active role. But I will now turn to Jeff.
Okay, thank you. So let me talk primarily about the meeting with President Putin, but then just add a couple of kind of framing observations on some of the other meetings that Angela already mentioned. So this is my second time going to the Valdai Club, so I haven't been there since the beginning, but I've been there once before, so I have at least a certain frame of reference to compare. The meeting with President Putin this time took place at his residence at Novogorova, just outside of Moscow. When I was there last year, it was a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, sort of country club. And so that means that, you know, this was a place where Putin was already hanging out. He had some meetings there earlier in the week, and we came and met with him. The room where the meeting took place was actually fairly confined, which made it difficult. I was sitting at the end of the table. I didn't really have a good view down to the end. I couldn't hear very well. It was very cramped and kind of uncomfortable. In the past, the meetings with the president have gone... Okay, sorry. In the past, the meetings with the president have gone on for multiple hours. Last year it was about a 3-hour meeting. This year we were told in advance it would be fairly short. It would be an hour and a half, and they would keep time very strictly, and that did in fact prove to be the case. Additionally, in terms of the format, in the past it was more freewheeling, where people sort of went around the table and raised their hand to ask questions. This time we were told questions should be prepared in advance, and there would be facilitators within the group of foreign participants who would collect questions and then would in turn pass them along to the president, and that those questions were to be limited to economic issues. And so for that reason, we didn't have the discussion that we've had in the past about Russian domestic politics or foreign policy, although domestic politics came up briefly, and I think illuminatingly at the end of the meeting. So in terms of the substance of the actual meeting, I think my overall takeaway was that, like many of the ministers and other officials that we met with, President Putin had a fairly sanguine view of the Russian economy and the political system. I think generally a sense that the protests that had broken out over the parliamentary and then the presidential elections were not an impediment anymore, that the country was essentially on the right path in terms of fixing its social and economic indicators. He acknowledged problems with the investment climate, with corruption, that said, you know, we're working, we're making progress. And the reforms that he discussed were primarily incremental. One of the comments that Sergei Ivanov made earlier was that Russia's had enough of revolutions. We don't need any more revolutions. And so, while recognizing that there are problems, while recognizing that the political system that the country has now may not be perfect, I think the consistent message that we got throughout the week, including from the meeting with President Putin, was that what reforms need to be taken, need to be done gradually, incrementally. In terms of some of the specific indicators that the president cited included the improvement in the ease of doing business, the improvement in Transparency International's ranking of corruption perceptions in Russia, even though the change was fairly slight. It went from about 135th place to 125th. But nevertheless, President Putin cited this as evidence that Russia is actually moving in the right direction. One of the participants asked him about this question of the brain drain and what it means for Russia. During the conference, one of the economists who had made a presentation had said, and this was something that we heard a couple of times, that Russia has three major exports today: energy, capital, and people. Energy is sort of separate, but the export of capital and people, I think a lot of people have pointed to as signs that Russia's economic competitiveness is declining. In response to the question about the brain drain, the outflow of talented people, particularly the youth, President Putin acknowledged that that's a problem. But he said the solution lies primarily in financial incentives. It lies in giving people better conditions for their work so that they'll choose to stay in Russia rather than going abroad. He discussed a scholarship program that the country was implementing to bring in foreign specialists, cited very positive numbers for the number of foreign scientists, for example, who had applied for these grants to come to Russia. And he said, we need to do more of this. We need to address the material concerns that are driving people in Russia to seek employment in the West and that are preventing people from other parts of the world from coming to work in Russia. So it was, again, very economically focused, not much in terms of social structure, in terms of political or cultural freedom. So to me, that was kind of revealing that this is primarily a question of management rather than a question of politics per se. Another interesting response, or telling response, I think, was when one of the foreign participants asked the president what he would like his legacy to be from his second term, or I guess third term, when the historians are writing, what he wants to be remembered for. And the president largely dismissed that question. He said, it's too early to talk about that. I'll sort of leave it to the historians to work out. And in the discussions that we were having among the foreign participants afterwards, the consensus that sort of emerged was that that was almost an indicator that there wasn't a bigger vision here. That, again, this is primarily a question of management. It's a question of tweaking around the edges rather than, setting out a big program, a bold program of reform, or looking several years into the future and trying to figure out where Russia is going to go and what steps we as a government need to take in order to get it there. Both before and after the meeting with Putin, we heard from people within the presidential administration that they thought the format and after the meeting, the actual meeting itself was not as productive this year as it had been in the past, and that there was dissatisfaction within the presidential administration, I think in part because the format made it difficult to have a more open discussion, in part because there were fewer kind of concrete proposals coming from the foreign expert community about areas where the Russian government could take steps to improve the situation in the future. One of the people within the Board Committee I was speaking with before the meeting was very critical of the report that was produced and said, it doesn't really offer much in the way that's concrete that we can actually use to think about where the country is going to go. I wouldn't be surprised if they decide they're not going to do this anymore. If this is going to be the last time that Valdai Club meets. During the meeting with President Putin, he confirmed that there would be a 10th anniversary meeting next year. But I think that there was a fairly high level of frustration both within the circles of the presidential administration and among the foreign participants with the way that the meetings were conducted this year and the inability to have a kind of open exchange that would allow the Russian government to get new ideas about where it needs to go and would allow the foreign participants to get a better view of how the administration and the government thinks about where Russia is and where it's going. The one time that domestic politics did creep up during the meeting with President Putin was on the issue of Pussy Riot. One of the questions was asked, despite the indications that we would only be allowed to talk about economic issues, why such a harsh sentence was passed against the participants in this protest. And again, I think it was kind of revealing the way in which President Putin responded to that question. He got very animated, I think much more animated than he had in responding to any of the kind of economic questions. He talked about how, you know, this took place in a church, it was offensive to believers, you know, how many millions of Orthodox believers suffered during the purges and during the Soviet era, and, you know, we have a duty to, you know, not to belittle them, to uphold their values, to protect them. And what these women who carried out the protest were doing was an affront to all of that. And, you know, the way he talked about it also made it sound as though he found it personally offensive. That, you know, having group sex in public, and, you know, a woman who's 9 months pregnant, and, you know, how can anybody do this? He said, you know, you in the West have standards for this kind of thing too. Like, this would be a crime anywhere, and I don't know why you are making such a big deal out of it. And then he invoked the filmmaker in California who made the Innocence of Muslims, I think, the anti-Islamic film that set off the protests in the Middle East. He said, you know, you Americans, you know, put him in prison too. Not, I think, appreciating the distinction that he was put in prison not for making the film, which was offensive, but rather for unrelated issues and for violating his parole. That was, I think, one of several instances during the evening where we got the impression that, you know, the president wasn't really the master of the details the way that he'd been during meetings in the past, that maybe he was being a little bit more pro forma about this. You know, I mean, yes, there's a cultural gap in terms of the way that these things are handled, but my impression from the Valdai meeting last year, and, you know, maybe you can correct me on the basis of previous ones, was that President Putin is always very sharp. He's always been very well briefed in advance of these meetings, and he always has all of the kind of relevant details at his fingertips. And I think this particular instance was one of a couple over the course of the evening where he just didn't quite have that same grasp, that same mastery of detail that we've seen from him in the past. That's, you know, sort of my impression, at least, of the meeting with President Putin. We didn't really get a chance to talk with him about foreign policy. Again, at the end of an hour and a half, he said, you know, okay, our time is up. You know, fairly quickly left the room. The meeting with Alexei Pushkov was really the only opportunity we had during the entire week, 4 days, whatever it was, to really have that conversation. And I thought that it was a very interesting conversation because of what was said and what wasn't said. You know, Pushkov talked about how, again, Russia is its own center of power, and this was really the idea behind the Eurasian Union, that there was this moment where there was this idea that Russia would become part of the West, would join into the West, in perhaps the 1990s, and that wasn't sustainable, and the West made a series of mistakes in the way that it carried out its approach to Russia. So now that moment has passed. That's not something that's going to come back. That's not part of the conversation in Moscow anymore. Of course, you know, Russia is not Asian. It's civilizationally different from China and Japan and Southeast Asia, so it's not going to become part of Asia. Instead, it is a major power. It's going to become a kind of global pole on its own, and it's going to become sort of the sun within a solar system that basically coincides with the borders, more or less, of the former Soviet Union. You know, not in an imperial way, but in a way that sort of builds on common cultural, economic, and political cultures to, you know, bring those post-Soviet countries in closer alignment with Russia. He said, you know, that doesn't mean that we're anti-Western or anti-American, but it changes the way that the relationship between Russia and the United States and between the West and the United States is going to work. When he was pushed on, you know, what are the prospects for cooperation in the future, you know, as Angelo said, you know, the reset, one, the reset succeeded, but two, the reset's over. And we have to think about sort of new opportunities for moving ahead. But the way that we do that is going to be with these kind of incremental approaches. He, you know, kind of recognized that on some of the big issues like Syria, there's kind of a fundamental disagreement between the two sides, and we're not going to overcome that disagreement. Where there is an opportunity to cooperate is on people-to-people contacts and economic cooperation, which, if you talk to people in the Obama administration, is basically the same thing that you hear. So I wouldn't be surprised if when we see sort of where U.S.-Russia relations are going to go over the next year or two, I think that may be the picture that we're going to get. You know, Pushkov is he's a close ally of the president. He was sort of put into his current position on the basis of that relationship. So I think to a fairly significant extent, you know, what he told us is sort of getting is speaking from the horse's mouth. Again, I would have liked to have had a little bit more of an opportunity to explore some of these questions in our other meetings, but just the format, the way that the Valdai meeting was set up this year just didn't allow us to do that. So we can turn it over to questions now.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just reiterate, this was a more choreographed meeting than any of the other previous ones have been, particularly during the meeting with the president, when 3 members of the group were assigned to collect questions only on economics, and then unfortunately some of the people who were allowed to ask questions asked 3 questions, so it meant that fewer and fewer people could ask questions. So, and of course in my experience of previous Valdais, President Putin likes talking about foreign policy and domestic politics too, so I can't believe it's because the Kremlin itself didn't want questions on foreign policy. One other thing that in the meeting with President Putin, the question of Rosneft came up, and he said he was actually against the deal in the beginning. He didn't, or he had doubts about Rosneft buying out both the BP and the TNK partners, the AAR partners, but he said now that it's done, you know, it can lead to something more productive. And then he said it could lead, he saw this as a move towards possibly greater privatization of Rosneft, and that I found a little difficult to make the leap, yeah, that's the only other thing. So, questions, comments?
One other quick thing. We found out right after the meeting with the president about his physical, yeah, we didn't. Problems. Right. We didn't really see any. There was no discussion of that. It wasn't clear from sort of looking at him that he had any.
But the only thing I will say is in every other meeting, he's walked around the whole table and shaken hands with everyone. And this time he just walked in and sat down and walked out. So if his back was bothering him, right, that could have, because I couldn't understand why he wouldn't have.
Yeah, well, the room was very tightly packed.
Right, that's true. But no, I agree. We didn't see any evidence of it. Harley.
Okay, since this was about economics,
yeah.
I'm wondering how much, if anything, beyond Dvorkovich saying WTO will help, came up about Russia's World Trade Organization. The only thing we've seen so far is this statement that they're going to introduce recycling fees for automobiles and agricultural machinery, which will be charged to foreigners, but Russians can be exempted by saying they'll recycle the stuff at the end of its useful life, which is already the first case against Russia that's going to go to WTO.
Well, I mean, I don't know what your impression is. Some people did talk about the fact that obviously this is difficult for some, as we knew it would be, for some Russian industries, and that's why there was so much opposition within Russia, right? From certain people, certain industries, to WTO membership. And I also heard several people say, well, now that we're in, we have, you know, in other words, we shouldn't just accept all these rules. Now that we're in, we're going to try and rethink some of these rules, and as you say, try and I mean, we've seen that what happened, right, when China joined. So, yeah, I mean, I think there was kind of uncertainty about ultimately how it's going to impact Russia. What was, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and you know, Russia's always been sort of interested in being at the table in these organizations. I think, like the WTO and a lot of the security organizations as well, and I think a lot of that has less to do with, you know, wanting to accept the rules than wanting to help write the rules. And I sort of see that with the WTO thing as well. During the discussions, there was a lot of, you know, innovation and, you know, how this was going to help promote innovation and, you know, what it meant for, you know, some of the older industries was, you know, I think the recognition was that it was not going to be overwhelmingly positive for some of the, you know, kind of old traditional Soviet industries, but yeah, it wasn't a huge subject of discussion.
Right. One thing Dvorkovich did say, which I forgot to mention, was that what he's really concerned about is the increasing economic competition from China. that Russia faces, not so much from other countries. And he expressed that quite strongly. Yeah.
Hi, Alex Van Oss. I teach about the Caucasus at the Foreign Service Institute. I understand the focus of the meeting was on the economy. Did you glean anything from cocktail conversation and so forth, anything about the North or South Caucasus or the USAID situation?
I mean, very little about the North Caucasus. There was some discussion of what had happened in Georgia and what the implications, although I never got the sense that they thought having Ivanishvili as prime minister would make that much difference in the Georgian-Russian relationship. I mean, no one was saying this is the dawn of a new era. And USAID, I mean, again, it was just in the context of we, Russia, are not a developing country, we don't need this, you know, we don't need foreign organizations to come in here. I don't know if you,
yeah, I mean, on the Caucasus,
yeah.
there really was very little. On USAID, you know, I agree with that, and I just add one thing, which was that to the extent that there was discussion of it, I think it was, they tried to spin it more as, you know, we're a developed country, and, you know, we don't need this, rather than this is an anti-American step. We don't like you sort of mucking around in our affairs. It's more, you know, it's not consistent with our dignity. It's a major power in the country.
yeah.
Norm Cass, until my retirement in 2010, I was the executive director of a commission that worked with the Russian government to account for missing servicemen. So I had the ample occasion to work with Russian officials, not so much, and not only in the economic sphere, but across the spectrum of power ministries and archives and the like. My question focuses on the views that you heard expressed by the Russians regarding the viability of the U.S. dollar as the gold standard for international trade, for balances, deposits that are held in banks. The work that I have done, I've come across any number of articles in the Russian media talking about the fact that the dollar should not have unchallenged the role that it's had historically, and in fact there have been various proposals that Russia develop an alternative currency to it. What's your sense of that as an issue from the discussions you've had?
I mean, I'll turn to you in a minute. I don't recall too much. I mean, obviously Russia has said, but announced a few years ago that, you know, Moscow should be an alternative financial center, global financial center. And they have Alexander Voloshin and other people, right, who are charged with creating this. I don't recall very much of this coming up, do you?
No. But, you know, what was interesting, in some ways, you know, certain elements of this were interesting by their absence. And, you know, the issue of the reserve currency didn't really come up. This issue of Russia as a financial center didn't really come up. And the issue of Skolkovo didn't really come up, which was, you know, a big deal during the Valdai meetings last year. So, you know, it's another way in which I think this, you know, this transition from Medvedev plus Putin to just Putin has kind of changed the climate a little bit.
Yeah, and in fact, Voloshin was at that breakfast organized by Sberbank, but yeah, but that issue didn't come up. Yeah. And questions? Yes, Kelly.
Yeah, you said there was a comment that actually outside investors were profiting more or more profitable than Russian investors. Could you unpack that a little bit? I don't understand why that would be.
Do you remember what that? Because definitely said that.
I don't have my notes.
You have your notes with you, right? Just somehow that it was,
Does that mean that they just pay more taxes?
is unprofitable for Russian investors. Yeah, I mean, maybe it did, well, yeah, and this is Boris Titov, who's obviously charged with improving the business climate in Russia for Russian businesses. I don't recall what, how he justified that. Yeah.
Look,
Yeah.
I wasn't there for all of the breakfast either.
Well, but this is Titov, who was on the panel in St. Petersburg, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but you may not have been there for all of that too. Yes, Martin.
Could you address and unpack the issue
Yeah.
of regional development coming into play as being a possible driver for Russia? Did they name names, regions,
No, well,
issues?
what they did was with these world economic scenarios, and I guess I had to lead the discussion of the scenario, and I had done some of this at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in June because these scenarios were developed there. So the scenario there was that somehow, there were economic problems, but the regions would somehow uphold particularly the agriculture as a way of kind of reviving the Russian economy. So it wasn't, and we obviously kind of raise issues of the regions on which you're an expert, where they do have lots of resources, but this wasn't so much the regions necessarily that had the energy or the diamonds or whatever, but this was the idea of somehow agriculture being the motor for economic
That's fascinating,
reform,
but how do you do that?
It's fascinating, and I have to admit that I found, and that's why I told the World Economic Forum people who were there, they had 3 people there, that at our table at least, we found it a little bit hard to see how this would happen. But we did have our colleague from The Economist, right? When he spoke, he thought that, again, agriculture was something which, if the Russian government, paid more attention, the local regions, that this could be something that could revive the economy. You're nodding, Harley, yes?
Well, Steve Wegren's written a lot about this. And WTO could really offer them serious opportunities to improve the agriculture, but it requires major reforms, and if they aren't undertaken, WTO is going to allow a lot more foreign imports less expensively, and it's going to wipe out a lot of the agriculture. So it's really an instance where if they don't do something fairly quickly, they're going to get clobbered.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing, which is that during the discussion of the scenarios and the presentation during the St. Petersburg part of the meeting, there was what to me was a surprising amount of disagreement between different people on the panel and then different people who were doing the scenarios about, what Russia's economic course needs to be. On the question of agriculture, that was one of the things that came up. Is this a comparative advantage that Russia needs to pursue? Is this something that it's, where it's, the past and we need to move forward into the kind of nanotech future? But another thing that I found really strange, the keynote presenter during the St. Petersburg part of the discussion was a well-respected economist, and he gave a very long kind of detailed presentation that the takeaway from which was basically that we need to move back towards a greater degree of state planning. Not sort of the way Gosplan did it, but kind of indicative planning. Like the state needs to sort of set targets and mobilize resources and figure out what the priorities for development are going to be. And during the discussion, at least at my table and during the scenario planning exercise, there was kind of a similar discussion about all the foreigners sort of saying, well, you need to liberalize, you need foreign investment, and some of the Russians agreeing, but some of the Russians saying, well, no, that's not really what you need to do. You need to ensure that the state's role in the economy is preserved and that it's more effective about figuring out which sectors it needs to focus on. So to me, it was very discordant.
Yeah, the state capitalism model did have quite a lot of support among some of the participants. That's true. Yeah.
You mentioned people-to-people contact, and in the past there's been extensive Youth for Understanding educational exchange and so forth. Is that still viewed positively, or is that also considered demeaning, sending people or having people come to the U.S. or wherever?
I think that's still viewed positively. I mean, certainly if we listen to even what Alexei Pushkov said.
Yeah.
I should say, after these discussions were over, a number of the American participants went to Spasa House, and we met with Ambassador Mankoff and some of his colleagues, and I think they certainly are going to be very interested in, pursuing this, given everything else that's going on, youth exchanges, education, cultural exchanges, things like that. So
Yeah.
I didn't get any sort of sense of blowback on that.
Yeah, my sense is that they view that fairly positively, and because it operates in 2 directions. So, where the funding comes from, I guess, can be an issue. But because it's Russians coming to the United States and then Americans going to Russia, I think that's generally seen as positive. And I know there've been a lot of just in the last year or so. I was involved with this Little League exchange, where where they had Russian baseball teams coming over and playing out in Virginia. And the Russian Foreign Ministry and the embassy were fairly helpful with that. So I don't think there's any kind of sense that there's a problem with that. I think the concern is more with foreign funded groups that, in the view of a lot of people within the administration and the political class more broadly, undermine Russian sovereignty by trying to affect the politics.
It was very difficult. I talked, I'm sure you did, quite a few people about what registering as a foreign agent means. And I think there's a lack of clarity about who's a foreign agent and what sources of money you have to get in order to have to declare yourself a foreign agent. And not everyone who gets foreign funds does have to declare themselves. So I think there's a lack of clarity there. But I do also think, coming back also to your point at the end about kind of the next steps in the U.S.-Russian relationship, I can really see the argument, given the fact that we've had a reset, we've accomplished some things, but we haven't accomplished other things. Instead of focusing on the big macro level, if one can focus on the smaller steps and the human dimension of it and things, that probably is one way, at least at the moment, to go forward. In the absence of the likelihood, we're not going to agree on Syria. We're still obviously going to cooperate with Russia on Afghanistan. It's very important for us. Iran as well, but in the absence of other huge initiatives, maybe that really, to go back to that level.
Yeah, and the thing that we didn't get to talk about again because of the economic focus was missile defense.
Right.
Because I think a lot of people kind of suspect, during President Obama's meeting with then President Medvedev, when he said, I'll have more flexibility after my re-election. Well, now he's been re-elected. But, a lot of the kind of pundit class, I guess, has been sort of speculating on what the Russian response to that is going to be, if there actually is going to be more flexibility on the Russian side, or more interest in reaching a deal, in a second Obama term, in a second Putin term. But we didn't really get a chance to talk about that, so I don't know what the thinking is at this point.
Yeah.
In terms of U.S.-Russia economic engagement, what's the Russia's agenda? Did Markovich elaborate on that one? Obviously, Russia wants U.S. to get rid of Jackson Vanik, but what else?
Right, and in fact, I think that Jackson Vanik really didn't come up. I think the Russian side is so fed up, right, with waiting for something to happen in the U.S. Congress. I didn't get a sense from Dark Court about what the agenda was for the U.S.-Russian economic relationship.
Yeah, I was in the
Oh, you
that
were
was
in
during
the
the other meeting.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. But I didn't really get it. He didn't really touch on it that much. He was talking more about, I think, the domestic economic situation.
And what about the euro crisis? Were they offering any, I don't want to say advice, but, looking askance perhaps at the European participants?
Yeah. The European participants themselves were, apologetic. There were also fewer European participants this time too, which was interesting, and
more Asians.
More Asians. We had one Latin American, Mexican, so it was a somewhat different foreign grouping. There were, only 2 Germans, for instance, whereas in the past there'd been more, just a couple of people from France. But they themselves were, I think, quite critical of their own government. We had discussions among ourselves with the Europeans about, is the euro going to last? Is the European Union going to last? Obviously Russia is adversely impacted by the euro crisis. Europe is a major trading partner, and it's in Russia's interest for the Europeans to get their own economic house in order.
Yeah, but I think this also sort of fit into Alexei Pushkov's remarks about Russia's aspirations vis-a-vis the West. That this was an example. Europe's moment maybe hasn't passed, but the attractiveness of Europe right now is less than it would have been, say, in the 1990s, and so that's kind of another reason why Russia's interested in kind of creating its own solar system, as Dmitry Trevin called it.
But we also, because we weren't talking about foreign policy, didn't hear that much about Russia's, if you like, turn to Asia, and greater focus on Asia and relations with different Asian countries. And again, because the focus was more domestic economic, that didn't come up very much. Yeah. But we did have more Chinese participants than ever, including what I gather is a fairly high party official. I mean, most of the participants in Valdai, or all of them, you know, they know Russian, or if they don't know Russian, they know English. But I mean, most of them know Russian. But this was a party official who didn't know Russian, didn't know English, and gave a rather formal talk, and then went. But I mean, it was a bit, but well, it was symbolic of having someone from a higher political representation. I mean, the other Chinese colleagues are either professors or, you know, journalists, think tank people. So
yeah, well, I don't know a lot about the structure of the Valdai organization as a whole, but you know, there's the big sort of Valdai meeting that they do once a year, and then there are these kind of satellite
regional ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one that's on defense, for example, and there's an Asian Valdai, which you know, as I gather, there's been a lot more emphasis on in the last couple of years, where they have primarily Chinese, but also, you know, Japanese and other Asian participants. You know, in these meetings where they talk specifically about Russia and Asia and Russia's relationships with Asia. And so I think part of this was an attempt to integrate that more closely into the kind of the big Valdai structure. So yeah, there were a number of Chinese participants. There have always been, or last year when I was there were also a large number of Japanese who were there again this year. There was an Indian participant this year.
There were 2 Indian
Was
participants.
there?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was new as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this, I think, a conscious attempt to make it less Western-centric, I suppose. Although still no, unless I'm missing somebody, people from other post-Soviet countries.
They had their first Scandinavian. We had a Finnish participant.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, no one from
The solar
any
system.
other CIS countries. What?
No one from the solar system.
No one from the
Yeah.
solar system. Any questions?
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about Gazprom, what's going on with Europe? Did they talk about the shale gas issue or the Eastern Development Program?
Well, see, last year we had a very interesting discussion on shale with President Putin, who got very animated about it.
Became an environmentalist.
Became an environmentalist. And criticized, because that was happening last year already, the EU's, you know, the unbundling and all of the third energy package and all of that. But that really didn't come up this time.
I mean, there was discussion about sort of Rosneft and, you know, the role of the state in the economy and what that meant for Russian development, but as a foreign policy issue, it didn't really come up.
Very little about that. Again, it was a narrowly focused discussion most of the time.
Yeah. And as I said, I think the feedback I got from the foreign participants and from the Ria Novostin presidential administration people was that format just didn't work. So I'm guessing it's not going to be repeated in that form.
Although I had one communication from one of the organizers saying that people thought that the format worked better this time than before. So,
Yeah,
but we were asked for our feedback, so.
Yeah, there were fewer questions about sort of, you know, Russo-Slovak relations.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think that was part of the reason for not having free-flowing questions, was not to have too narrowly focused questions from individuals about their own country. But I think you could obviously find a happy medium between that and then having everything completely choreographed, in a sense, to talk about narrow economic issues. But I guess they promised a 10th anniversary, and the president said it would be something festive, so. We'll stay tuned. Okay, thank you for coming.